There have been a lot of really tense times, and this is probably the worst. Quite possibly we'll see the US attack Venezuela. They'll blow up boats, then they'll start airstrikes or drone strikes. Maybe they'll target the oil infrastructure. I do think the timeline is short. Every country in the world, the Americans have a group of people ready to take over. There are millions of people, armed people. The entire Venezuelan army believes in this project. They're not gonna take it lightly. If they kill Maduro and they install one of these people, it's gonna be a disaster. It's gonna be a guerrilla war. It's gonna be an insurgency and a quagmire. The idea that the Americans can just blow up a boat and just completely make up a lie that this was some kind of drug boat and nobody cares. And that makes it really, really dangerous. I don't see any signs of de-escalation on the horizon. On the contrary, I see everything that's happening emboldening the Americans to do the next thing.
World War III is already happening.
This is a house of cards, and it is in the process of collapsing right now.
You're going to see an economic crash, the likes of which we've never seen.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today we're joined by Justin Podur, Associate Professor at York University, co-author of The Extraordinary Threat, the U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. Also host of the Anti-Empire Project. Justin, welcome and thanks for coming out today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So my audience, well, maybe I shouldn't speak for my audience, but myself personally, I'm not very, well versed in Venezuelan history and just in terms of the politics of the region. Obviously, the buzz right now is that there might be some sort of military engagement. It looks like the United States is amassing significant military force within that region. What do you think the likelihood of war with Venezuela is? And is it about oil?
Right. Okay. Great questions. I'll start with
I thought I would start at the end, and then we'll work our way back.
Absolutely. Yeah. I unfortunately think that the likelihood of the U.S. going to a more kinetic form of warfare against Venezuela is quite high right now. I do think that for several reasons. So the first reason is because of the trajectory over the past month or two with the naval buildup and the attacks against these fishing boats mainly, just completely. And the way that these have played out in U.S. foreign policy, in other areas of foreign policy, there's this concept of like a trial balloon, right? Where they do something relatively small, they'll commit some kind of crime openly, and they'll just see how people react, right? So they attack one boat, they board one boat, they attack a third boat, and they see, it didn't really, there haven't been severe consequences to the U.S. Foreign policy establishment, to the U.S. For doing these things. Mm-hmm. So there's no reason for them to think that if they scale up and do something else, that there will then be consequences. So I see this kind of rolling forward in this really ugly and scary way, based on that short-term pattern. Now, there's also the long-term pattern, which you mentioned our book, me and Joe Emmersberger, which the subtitle includes 20 years of coup attempts in Venezuela. The book came out in 2020, so we're now up to 25 years or something of coup attempts in Venezuela, and it is a continuous history. So the first coup against Venezuela in recent history was 2002, and that coup happened. They overthrew the government. It lasted a couple of days, but after they managed to the popular uprising and the army support for the president. The people reversed the coup, and Hugo Chavez came back to power. But then there have been continuous attempts to overthrow the government one way or another ever since, and we can get into all the details of that as we go backward. But long-term trends, short-term trends, and now about oil. Okay. So the oil question is an interesting question because it is about oil in a lot of ways, but it's not I wouldn't say it's fundamentally about oil because they attack countries that don't have oil too. So, for example, Cuba is under sanctions. Cuba is also a country where the US is always trying to overthrow the regime. Cuba is an ally of Venezuela. Cuba helps Venezuela a lot. Venezuela has helped Cuba a lot. Haiti in the Caribbean is another country where the US has overthrown elected leaders, installed a kind of multilateral force there. They're constantly imposing various kinds of governments and military forces on Haiti. So those countries don't have oil. Venezuela has oil. So there's an extra level of interest in Venezuela, but that interest that the US has since the Monroe Doctrine going back 100 years or more, basically that the US is going to be the imperial power in the entire Americas in the Western Hemisphere, at least. I mean, also the Middle East, also the rest of the world, but they have this special claim where they say, the Western Hemisphere is ours, no other, nobody else is allowed to do things here. And so that means there's no square inch of Latin America or the Caribbean that the US doesn't feel the right to intervene and interfere and decide who's in power and who's out and decide what kinds of business they're allowed to do and with whom. So
is that because it's a strategic staging ground for, bigger countries out in the East, Russia, China? Because in Cuba, they did, and I don't know much about it, but I presume a lot of it was Cuban Missile Crisis related, and they were worried about perhaps the Russians gaining some sort of foothold there. It seemed like insofar as that situation was resolved, they didn't really seek to push it further because there wasn't much to gain financially, whereas in these other countries like, Iraq, or there might be a significant amount of natural resource wealth, they seem to be more persistent. So, but do you think the Venezuelan thing is more of they don't want the Russians and the Chinese to establish some sort of strategic relationship there, or is it more natural resources? Or is it simply by virtue of the fact that they're in the way?
It's none of those, I would say. So the reason I think it's none of those is because when you have imperialism, when you have a situation of inequality in the world between rich countries and poor countries, what the Russian government calls the golden billion, right? Where the golden billion is like America, Canada, Europe, Western Europe, basically the countries that are considered developed. Japan, I guess, is in there. And those countries have, again, studying the kind of global political economic relationship, those countries are draining. So this is like a political economy that comes from India in 100 years ago, where this economist named Nauroji, he wrote a book called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, and he was arguing that the British were draining wealth from India. So every year, Indians were producing so much food, they were producing so much in minerals and gold and silver, and the British were basically draining it. It was sophisticated. It looks like trade and taxes, but ultimately, the poor countries are subsidizing the rich countries. And that was the case under the British Empire, and that is the case today in the world where that is kind of governed by the United States. So when you look at Cuba, when you look at Venezuela, when you look even at Haiti, these are countries where you have, in Cuba, there was a revolution in 1959. In Haiti, there was a kind of a revolution in the 1990s. And in Venezuela, there was this so-called Bolivarian revolution, a series of elections also in the late 1990s that brought the Chavistas, the followers of Hugo Chavez, to power. All of these countries have a kind of politics, which is basically, to put it really simply, about the country's resources, whatever they are meant to benefit the people of that country. And that concept includes just a concept of national sovereignty. So they're always appealing to national sovereignty, where in Venezuela, this is how the oil comes in. The oil comes in because the state-owned oil company, which is called PDVSA is the acronym, the Petróleos de Venezuela. So the oil company is supposed to sell the oil on the international market, and then the benefits of that are supposed to go to the people for health, for education, for all of these things. And instead, prior to the revolution in Venezuela, all of these benefits were going out of the country. They were going to the United States mainly, to a small group of people in the country. And likewise with Haiti, the people were miserable, and the president Aristide wanted to raise the minimum wage from an absolute misery to a dignified poverty. That was his slogan. In Cuba, they had the revolution for land reform. Peasants wanted to have access to land, all of these kinds of miserable relations of poverty in the 1950s in Cuba. So the common denominator with these countries in the Americas is not resources, and it's not even necessarily countries like China or Russia trying to get a foothold. It's more that they are interested in national sovereignty, in the resources of the country going to the people. And that is what the US opposes, because the US wants to be able to dictate where the resources of every country goes. And they want most of those resources to go to themselves and their own wealthy 1%. And so that's what I would say is motivating the U.S. And that's why you when you think of the Americas, whether you're thinking of the Americas or the Middle East, you will find that the U.S. leaves no stone unturned. Anybody who's rebellious will be punished. Anybody who wants the resources to go to their own country will be punished somehow. And that goes for small countries, and that goes for huge countries. So even the problem with China, I would say the U.S.'s problem with China is the same problem they have with everybody else, that China wants all of Chinese labor and Chinese efforts to go to the benefit of Chinese people.
So it's about oil, but in a more circuitous sort of way, you're saying.
Yeah, and like historically, if you go way back, so there's a book, there's a little anecdote where the president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, when Barack Obama was elected president of the US, there was a lot of people who had hope that things were going to change in the relationship between America, the US, and Latin America. And so Chavez handed President Obama a copy of a very famous book in Latin America. It is like a book called The Open Veins of Latin America. And it's by a famous author named Eduardo Galeano. And this book basically outlines all of the ways that the resources of the Americas, all the Latin American countries, continuously flow to the United States, and how these countries are pillaged and plundered by the US over hundreds of years. And Galeano says something really interesting about Venezuela. Venezuela used to be a country of cacao, like chocolate. It used to be exploited for its chocolate. And then oil was discovered, and now it's exploited for its oil. So the exploitation has never changed, even though the resource has changed. And the same with Bolivia. Bolivia used to be a country of silver, and now it's a country of tin. So whatever the resource is, it changes, but the relationship of the resource flowing to America with no benefit to the people remains the same.
This military buildup is different, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, this is different.
Did we see anything like this for Cuba or places that didn't have a significant amount of resources? Or why is this different? Why now? And is there something to do with the current, more volatile energy market that is to do with this?
Yeah.
In light of the other, in light of the global events that are unfolding with Iran, Ukraine, Russia type thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're very, very right to ask that question. So let's get into the oil issue a little bit more. So after the 2002 coup, which was reversed, the United States decided to attack Venezuela through the oil company. So Venezuela's main source of revenue continues to be oil. Like lots of countries, Saudi Arabia, lots of oil. There are lots of oil countries out there.
And sorry to interrupt you, because
No problem.
I recall that Venezuela wasn't always the largest global oil reserve country. Like, that was only a recent discovery in the last 20 years or so, hasn't it been?
Yeah. So oil reserves, proven reserves. I think in terms of the amount of energy you can get out of the ground, I think Saudi Arabia is still number one. Mm-hmm. But I think there's a type of heavy crude and proven reserves, because there's much more oil in the ground. This is the environmental argument, but like there's much more oil in the ground than we could possibly burn and still have a planet at the end. So the question is always like cost. The question is like, how much is it going to cost more energy to get that oil out than it is to, and so as technology changes, reserves of oil can come online because technology to extract them becomes cheaper. So I'm not actually sure where Venezuela fits right now. But yes, they have gigantic reserves. But like what I want to tell you a little bit more about, if that's okay, is the oil industry. So the oil industry of Venezuela started to come under attack after 2002. So in 2003, there was all the managers of the oil company went on strike. And so they were trying to bring the oil industry to its knees so that the government would be overthrown and they could replace it with the pro-US government. So the Bolivarians, the pro-Chavez people, responded by basically firing all the managers and having the workers kind of take over and step into those positions. But the U.S. initiated a really brutal sanctions regime on Venezuela, so that all of the kinds of parts, running an oil industry is really high tech, really complex. And so spare parts, these kinds of technologies, they're all, it's also easy to block, right? Because it's not like you go on Amazon and you buy a spare part for an oil well. I don't even know the industry that well to know what these parts are. But it's like, once the US decided to block that, the degradation of Venezuela's oil industry became more and more important. And so attacking Venezuela through that by denying them revenue, which means they can't have their programs, which means they are eventually going to, this reminded me of a campaign similar to this against Chile. Chile elected a socialist government in 1971, I believe. And then in 1973, that government was overthrown in a coup. Salvador Allende was his name, and he was overthrown, and Augusto Pinochet took over for decades. Allende was killed, and there was a sanctions regime on Chile. And I believe it was Kissinger, one of these really high-profile American leaders, said, we're going to make the Chilean economy scream. So they're making the economy scream is part of America's policy weapons. So they were trying to make the Venezuelan economy scream, and they did. There's a lot of suffering in Venezuela. There's even more suffering in Cuba because it's a smaller country and it's an island, and the sanctions are even more brutal against Cuba. But Venezuela's economy has screamed. And then this is where Iran comes in, and China, but especially Iran. Iran actually broke the blockade against Venezuela and challenged the U.S. Navy. So Iran said, we are coming, we're going to deliver oil and spare parts and help Venezuela's economy get going again.
When was this?
This was maybe 5 years ago, or a little bit. It was not too long, but there was this tanker heading to Venezuela from Iran, and everybody was wondering what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. Where was the U.S. going to blow this tanker up? What was going to happen? And you can look it up. You'll see photos of the Venezuelans meeting them and on the shore, and that's how Venezuela's gotten to some extent their oil industry running again. And China's buying the oil, so there is a whole series of actors that have stepped in to prevent the U.S. from destroying Venezuela through the oil industry. And that is a big part of why the U.S. wants to step up their naval presence. They want to make sure that if they can isolate Venezuela successfully, then they can once again try to make the economy scream. Now, if that doesn't work, because Venezuela has a lot of options now, a lot of friends in the world, and locally the other countries don't seem to be playing along quite as well as they have with the American plan. So as a result of all that, quite possibly will see the U.S. attack Venezuela more directly with missiles and bombings.
So is this a setup for an embargo then, by the sounds of things, of other countries coming to Venezuelan aid? Is that what the NATO position is about?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the tools of American foreign policy is sanctions. And they have sanctions where they say, we're not going to trade with you. But then they have sanctions where they say anybody who does trade with you is also going to get in big trouble. So that's where Cuba has been in a lot of problems, because Cuba, there's a lot of things that Cuba would be able to get if the Americans would trade with them. But there's a lot of things that Cuba can't get because the Americans won't let anybody else trade with them. And so they're doing the same with Venezuela. And yeah, they recognize, especially after the Iranian ship came in and the Iranian cooperation is there, that if they want to actually try to blockade Venezuela or other countries, they're going to have to physically do it. And that is
so the goal in Venezuela is regime change. Is that the goal?
Yeah. So whenever there's a country that wants sovereignty, the goal becomes regime change. So there's active regime change campaigns against in the Americas, definitely against the Cuba, and Venezuela would be the number 2 and 1 targets right now.
And so who's in line? Like, who do they want to be in power there?
Okay, that's so they have in every country in the world, the Americans have a group of people ready to take over, especially in Venezuela specifically. This was, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. Starting around then, they set up somebody where they said, this guy's actually the president. His name was Juan Guaido. And Juan Guaido was running all over the place. He was in Venezuela. The Venezuelans didn't arrest him.
Kind of like the Iranian Shah. That one, what's that guy's name?
Yeah,
he's the real leader, right?
Pahlavi. Yeah. His name. So Guaido was. The Americans said we're going to recognize Guaido. That they used that recognition of Guaido and de-recognition of Maduro to justify a whole bunch of additional thefts of Venezuela's assets. So this was where the Bank of England stole all of Venezuela's gold, which was held in the Bank of England. They said, well, Venezuela is not, right? Until Venezuela can clarify, because the Americans are not recognizing that Maduro is the president, we're going to have to steal their gold. So there's hundreds of millions of Venezuela's gold that the British have stolen, and it's sitting in a vault. The British have simply stolen it. They did the same to, I think the Americans did the same, and Europeans have done the same to Russia.
And that's why you don't store your gold in London, folks.
That's why you don't store your gold in London. It's much safer under your mattress. Yeah. You probably have.
Yeah, we know.
Yeah. You know where to put the gold. So yeah, they stole their assets. They turned over. They kicked the Venezuelans out of the embassy in Washington, and they created this. They created this kind of crisis where they said Maduro's not the real leader, and they're continuing that today. So they have people based in Miami. They're usually lots of people based in Miami, but they have others in other countries in Latin America, and they're a group. They call themselves the opposition. and they're ready to take over. One of the leaders is a woman named Maria Corina Machado. They're connected to Harvard. There's people at Harvard Kennedy School of Government that are in the opposition. So it's also a phenomenon where when the Americans want overthrow someone, they have the exiles. So they have Cuban exiles ready. They had Haitian exiles ready when they overthrew that government in 2004. They had a dictator ready when they overthrew Allende in Chile, and they have a group of people ready to overthrow the government in Venezuela as well.
Okay, so how do you think this plays out then? You're saying that they're going to potentially start doing airstrikes, like on whom? Like, what is the military capability of Venezuela to defend itself, and who might come to their aid? Are they going to be able to muster a formidable defense, or is it going to ultimately end in disaster for Maduro?
It's going to end in disaster for everybody, depending on the intensity with which the Americans pursue this. So the position of Venezuela militarily is they have a military that's known for being supported by the people. They have a relationship between the military and the people that's very different from what anybody would imagine. That is one of the specifics of the Bolivarian Revolution, is that the most revolutionary institution in Venezuela is the army. And this is not normal. This is usually the army in a Latin American country is usually the bastion, and anywhere is usually the most conservative element in the country. So in Venezuela, the army and the people collaborate in a lot of things. And so if there were to be an invasion, if there were to be troops, American troops, this would be, I think, very unfavorable to America, because the people in Venezuela are armed. Venezuela traditionally is an armed society, even before this revolution in the 90s.
What are the gun rights in Venezuela? Do they have freedom to bear arms there?
They sure do.
Yeah,
they sure do.
That's interesting, because I was told that like communist countries don't have armed citizenry.
Well, Venezuela is not communist per se. Venezuela is, they call themselves moving towards socialism. That's sort of like their idea. So communism is, even the Chinese government, they call themselves a communist party, but they don't claim to have achieved communism. So in communist ideology, communism is like a high stage where you don't need a government really, everybody just does, everybody is free to produce, and it somehow self-organizes. So communism is like this distant ideal for the future. And socialism is more like where the government intervenes to make sure there's equality and there's a good healthcare system and there's good public education and standards. So Venezuela is not communist. I would argue, they're aspiring towards socialism. It's very different than what people imagine. If you go to Venezuela, it's just like any other country. Like if you go to Colombia and then you go to Venezuela, you won't see much difference culturally.
If there's a ground invasion, it's not going to go well. So they're going to try to do this from a distance.
Yeah.
But how then do they supplant the current government if they can't establish some sort of foothold on the ground? Are you thinking like a decapitation? Is that going to be their...
Yeah. That is their MO, right? I mean, I think they've tried a drone strike on Maduro several years ago, and if you look up the reporting on this, it's horrendous, as you would predict. But basically they did this drone strike. It obviously didn't kill Maduro, and then it was reported in the American press as attempt on Maduro's life, says Maduro. And it was this kind of snarky, like, he says, we tried to kill him. Who knows? Right. So, I think this whole bounty that they've said, $50 million for Maduro's, arrest or or assassination. I think yesterday or today, the Americans said we're not going to try to find a solution. They said we're abandoning any diplomatic track to resolving this crisis, which the Americans have completely created out of nothing. There's no crisis. There's no drugs coming from Venezuela in any significant amounts. There's, the drugs come from Colombia and Mexico. So there's a completely made up crisis in terms of supposed drugs from Venezuela. But the Americans have said we're abandoning that track. So I think the most likely scenario is they're going to just kind of keep turning that dial. So they've been blowing up boats. They'll blow up boats. Then they'll start airstrikes or drone strikes of targets in Caracas, or maybe they'll target the oil infrastructure, and they'll just kind of do terrorism and sanctions and try to destabilize and harm Venezuela.
It seems weird that they're trying to do this now, though, when they're stretched so thin. I mean, there's got to be some reason why time is of the essence here, because they seem to be moving quite fast in light of the fact that there's no clear and present imminent threat. No, obviously, the narco-terrorist thing is bullshit. Everybody knows that. So why is there this sense of urgency to move then? I think that it's inexplicable in light of the fact that they are so overstretched abroad that they would commit such a significant portion of their capability to this region, presumably out for no apparent reason.
Yeah, well, I think they're going to try to do it on the cheap, so to speak. So I don't think they're going to commit a lot of military resources. I don't see, I always am scared to say things like this, but I don't see them sending a big ground force to Venezuela. I think anybody can run those numbers.
But why do anything now? Like, what was
I see.
Why is the threat a big deal now? Like, why is Maduro so scary all of a sudden?
There could be certain things with, again, the oil markets, like you said. So this past year, Venezuela has had the highest exports of oil since their oil industry came under attack. So if Venezuela can get, if they can kind of consolidate their oil industry, get it back under control, establish a solid market in China, then and it's another part of the world that is just completely out of American control. And if they can consolidate their revolution and fulfill what they want, which is to give more and more of their resources to their own people, that'll also be, that's something that the Americans don't want. There's a writer, Noam Chomsky. He's not active anymore, but he wrote a lot. He's written a lot about U.S. foreign policy in the Americas. And he called Cuba and other countries, he said it's and Nicaragua back in the day in the 80s, what he called it was a threat of a good example. So if Venezuela is able to just have this movement towards socialism and devote an increasing share of their resources to their own people, then other countries in the Americas might say, why can't we have what Venezuela has? And start doing the same thing, rewriting their constitutions and including all of these things with their resources. And so that trying to prevent that from happening is one reason. Like you said, there's a case. They want to go to war with Iran. They want to go. They want to support Israel in Gaza and wherever else. And there's this instability. They want to contain China. Why would they do this in Venezuela? But it's actually, I think of those as things that go together. So it's actually that if they go to war on Iran, if they can exclude Iran and Iran's economy from developing, if they can stop that from happening and they can stop Venezuela from developing, They can actually, if it is to, what you said earlier on in this interview about Russia and China not getting a foothold, there is something like a big game going on where the Americans are trying to consolidate their control over resources and over countries to prevent China from having those relations. So China is going to be the market for Venezuela. China is going around to Africa and establishing markets for these resources and giving more fairer prices and better deals than the Western countries do. And the better, the Americans can't conceive of saying, hey, the Chinese are offering this, we'll offer more. No, they see it as, this is our backyard, and you're going to do what you're told or else, and then we'll make you suffer. So I think it could, in the long run, it's kind of the position of a monopoly, the position of being able to dictate what happens, that is being eroded by China and even in Venezuela, Iran, and these other powers.
So, we're talking about a potential largely destabilizing event unfolding in the near term. We're speaking about it in a way that seems kind of, I don't know, like it's going to be a benign situation, but couldn't that trigger instability in surrounding countries? Like, couldn't there be some unexpected knock-on effects here, not only for the surrounding region, but for the U.S. itself, especially if they do fail to get him deposed?
Yeah, if they fail, if they succeed, because if they kill Maduro, God forbid, and they install one of these people they're cooking in Miami, well, there's gonna be an insurgency. The revolution, there are millions of people, armed people, that believe in this project. The entire Venezuelan army believes in this project. They're not going to take it lightly, and they're not gonna be herded into supporting a new dictator that's going to undermine everything that they've done. So it's going to be a disaster. It's going to be a guerrilla war. It's going to be an insurgency and a quagmire, even if they succeed in overthrowing Maduro, which I don't think they would. As far as other kinds of disasters that would ensue, I mean, if you look at Iraq 2003 and the invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, or go back to the 1990-91 invasion, we're still feeling that disaster today in so many ways, right? It was so destabilizing in so many ways of the American economy long term, of the world economy, of the relations, obviously of the Middle East. And a Venezuela invasion by the Americans, or even a regime change that resulted in an insurgency, I think it would be on that scale. I think it would be a disaster for decades. It would be so many unforeseen effects, and so it could be a long war. It could go on for a long time. It could, like you said, it could destabilize Colombia, which is already not stable. It could destabilize Brazil. All of those neighbors. There's a lot of really bad things that would follow as the Americans pursue this course, which is why it's such a horrible thing to watch, because I don't see any signs of de-escalation on the horizon. On the contrary, I see everything that's happening is emboldening the Americans to do the next thing.
Are any of the rumors about Maduro true? I mean, typically, before we go into a place, we tend to demonize and vilify the leader, whether it was Gaddafi or Mugabe, or, pick your villain of the week. Is there any, thing that is true there? Is there any drug trafficking? Is there any illegal activity, or are these claims all unfounded in your opinion?
There's nothing there. So people have this thing where there's smoke, there's fire, right? As preppers, you guys know, fire. But no, not here. In this case, no. And part of the reason you know it is because Maduro has been there for a long time now. Chavez died, I believe, in 2013. Maduro has been president for a good, decade. There's been several elections, and Maduro was never criticized for drugs until a couple of, 2 or 3 years ago is when they started. Yeah. Until then, it was always, they're not following the Constitution. The National Assembly should have met for a third time before swearing. It was all kinds of procedural things that they were arguing. They made up the drugs issue out of whole cloth relatively recently to criticize Maduro. So the drugs is not there. Now, the democracy argument is also, I don't really accept it because there are, first of all, the Americans don't care about democracy. Obviously, they support the Saudis, which is a family, Saudi and Qatar and so many of these places are run by families. For life. But leaving that aside, and let's say elections are the test, Maduro and Chavez before him, they have elections all the time. And in fact, they have elections in which the opposition is openly pro-US and they run and they lose. And when they lose, the Americans say, no, they won. Actually,
and they don't all get killed.
Yeah, they don't all get killed. Exactly. They're at large. There is a critique that some people made of Maduro, which is like, why didn't you arrest Juan Guaido? You couldn't go around America saying you're the real president and have that, have China sponsor you and stuff and steal American assets in your name. Like that wouldn't fly. And Maduro, obviously, like for political reasons, like not wanting to give the U.S. more pretexts, but also presumably because he sort of feels like, well, let these people, this is our system. Like these people can say what they want. And so there is a lot of political freedom in Venezuela, much more than people realize, including do vicious. Yeah.
Because, in Russia, people always kind of make that claim, but there's people who fall out of windows there. There's things that happen, there's restrictions on protest and stuff. So, I mean, as an objective outsider, I'm trying to figure out, what are the claims against Maduro that people make that, and if you were to kind of steel man the argument, is there anything there at all?
No, before I got into Venezuela, which I started studying Venezuela carefully and going there and stuff after 2002. But for a good 2 or 3 years prior to that, I was focused a lot on Colombia. And Colombia had an insurgency, and it had a really brutal American-sponsored counterinsurgency where they killed thousands and thousands of people. People trying to organize unions, people they would always claim they're part of the left-wing guerrillas and kill them. And they killed native people, lots of indigenous people, lots of Afro-Colombians. They were murdering people, stealing their land, all of these things. And so when you talk about repression or you talk about a government being brutal towards its people, I would say Colombia is one of the worst. And that's under that, that's a ally of America. Now, Colombia has a president now, Gustavo Petro, who's kind of the left and very critical of Israel and he's trying to change that. But the establishment, the deep state of Colombia is very deep. And they're still brutalizing people all over the country, not under Petro's control, but because Petro doesn't have full control. And so when you compare Colombia and Venezuela, it's not comparable in terms of what kind of standard do we hold a country like Venezuela to? Because the repression in Venezuela is not even, you don't have Venezuelan army controlling Venezuelan cities right now that are in the opposition. You have that in the States, right? Like they sent in Texan National Guards to Chicago. They have ICE running amok all over cities in the U.S.
I think they're even talking about putting the military in now.
Yeah,
like the actual military. Yeah.
So and I mean that there's nothing like that in Venezuela. The military in Venezuela, like I said, is anomalously supported by the people to an anomalous degree. So it's just.
So they're claiming they're claiming, like, what are the claims? He's a drug trafficker. False. Is there anything beyond that?
Yeah, basically a drug trafficker, and he's lost electoral legitimacy because of, he stole an election or something.
Oh, okay.
But he didn't.
And now in terms of the drugs, it's based on what I know, Venezuela is not a big exporter of drugs.
No.
Why
would they? They have oil, right? like why would you like the drug? So if you look at the global, let's just never mind the global, but like if you look at the Americas, coca leaf is cultivated, a lot of it in Bolivia, some in Ecuador, some in Colombia, and Colombia has a ton of different resources, but like it's a huge country too, and there's peasants and it's a traditional plant. It plays a role in indigenous life, right? And you can chew it, and then you can work longer. There's all kinds of properties that this coca leaf has, and so coca leaf is cultivated in all those places. Venezuela is just for this reason alone, it's a country where one resource plays a disproportionate role, and that's oil. And so you don't need, their poverty alleviation strategy as a government would be, let's get more of the benefits of oil to the people, not let's grow coca or trans. And if you look at the roots, right? If you look at where Venezuela is, it's not better placed than as a transshipment point, like. Colombia is better placed and therefore is a better transshipment point. Like you look at the geography, you look at the economy, there's just nothing to suggest that Venezuela would even theoretically be a good place to do this from or in.
And the idea that they would muster this massive, armada of ships and all this stuff just seems ridiculous, that they're using these state-of-the-art drones and to take out these little fishing boats. None of it makes sense at all, but there seems to be no scrutiny, and it seems to almost be bipartisan in
absolutely.
Both U.S. and not just U.S. I mean, Canada's kind of on board with anything the U.S. does, it seems, geopolitically. So including like renegotiating a trade deal that was fine, whatever, the trade deal was what it was, and then Trump decided it's off, and then now all the news is, are we going to get a deal? Like, we had a deal. Yeah,
it's bizarre.
Okay, well, this has definitely been very enlightening. Is there anything else that people should know, or like, what do you expect the timeline with this to be? Do you think we're going to see this thing really accelerate this year, or is there a time frame that you envision?
Well, I think so there have been really tense moments in the past where I thought the Americans are really going for it. It happens around elections. Venezuelan elections are always a good time to try to get rid of Maduro or Chavez before him. There was a stunt on the border. It was called the AIDS stunt. Your audience can look that up, where Juan Guaido, the person the Americans had decided was going to be the president, he was in Colombia and he crossed over with a group of people. It was supposed to be like some kind of armed assault on Venezuela, and it just fizzled. Nobody knew what their proper roles were supposed to be, and the people sent in to invade didn't know where to drive. Like, it was just kind of a logistical disaster. There was mercenaries. There was a mercenary group called Silver Corps, I think. They invaded Venezuela. Their plan was to kill Maduro and help facilitate the overthrow of the government. That was just 2 or 3 years ago. It wasn't very long ago. And they were all caught and they were arrested and they were in Venezuelan prison for a long time and exchanged for some Venezuelan prisoners, actually, pretty recently. So there have been a lot of really tense times, and this is probably the worst. This is what I was building up to. This is the worst I've ever seen. The idea that the Americans can just blow up a boat and display that and be proud of that and just completely make up a lie that this was some kind of drug boat and it just
Nobody cares.
And nobody cares. And that makes it really, really dangerous. And there's been, I was saying this, like when the Israelis bombed Qatar, a month or two ago, and there was like this Arab summit and all the Arab countries came and they said, oh, please don't bomb Qatar again. And there was a lot of like disdain for the Arabs because they saying like, oh, they didn't do anything. They just wrote a strongly worded memo. But the countries of Latin America didn't do that over these boats. It would have been really good, even if it was toothless, for Mexico and Colombia and Brazil and everybody to have a summit and say, hey, America, we don't want this. And we've seen some statements, but it hasn't been strong enough, in my opinion, to make the Americans think twice about this. So I do think the timeline is short, unless something changes. So there have been times in the past. There was a big deal where the Colombian army was purchasing a whole bunch of tanks to position on the border with Venezuela, and it was we were all very nervous. I think it was around 2003 or 5. And Venezuela engaged in some very clever diplomacy at that point. They went to the Spanish who were selling the tanks and convinced the Spanish to cancel the deal. And so the Venezuelans are so clever and resourceful that I wouldn't be surprised if they're working a whole number of angles to find a really graceful way out of this. It's just that the American, Trump and Rubio are so committed to this now that it's going to be really, really difficult. But I hope if I have a hope for this being de-escalated somehow, it would be diplomacy involving other countries of the Americas who say, listen, like, if you do this, there's going to be consequences, diplomatic and other consequences.
Just to make sure that we covered all the bases here, because we didn't really talk about Russian-Chinese military involvement. What do you know about the capabilities of like their air defense? Like, are they being supplied with any significant weapon systems from the big players?
So they do have a relationship with Russia and China. And I think in terms of weapons, I think they have some Russian air defense. I think they have some, and I think they're presumably, they're smart people. They're probably getting as much of that in place as they possibly can. So I don't know. Because you never know until there's a war. The only way to test this is in a war, right? But I think in theory, Venezuelan air defense is also at this point not trivial. It's not a trivial matter. It wouldn't be a trivial matter to do bombing runs completely cost-free against Venezuela at this point. I do think there would be some aid in that form in terms of selling weapons from Russia, and there would also be, I think there would be some kinds of I don't think much of the United Nations anymore. I don't know if I ever did, but I think there would be at that forum a lot of condemnation of the attack and a lot of diplomatic buzz around this being a violation of sovereignty and stuff like that. So I think there are possibilities for avoiding this. And yes, in terms of Russian and Chinese weapons, I think there is definitely a relationship in terms of Russia being an arms supplier to Venezuela.
Okay. All right. We could probably get into the much, broader involvement of other South American countries, but that's probably another conversation in and of itself. I want to thank you for coming out today. And where can people find more information about what you do?
Yeah, so the book, like I said, is Extraordinary Threat. My co-author Joe Emersberger and me, you can look that up. But I have a podcast, like you said, the Anti-Empire Project on YouTube. It's got the same name. I focus almost entirely on Gaza for the past couple of years, but there's a historical podcast that we do where we talk about like long-term historical trends. So that's where you can find me. Thanks a lot, Nate. This was a lot of fun. I always like talking about Venezuela.
Well, we're trying to get the word out there and educate people on these things because it's a bit of a blind spot for a lot of people. So you've definitely shed a lot of light on it today, and we will post those links in the description below. Thanks a lot for coming out. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Nate.
Take care.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.